The foundational theory for how to fix the anime industry has been laid out many times by Hayao Miyazaki throughout his career. I'm going to read you a passage that he wrote in 1979, at a time when the only things he would have actually directed so far would have been the Future Boy Conan TV series and the Lupin the Third Castle of Cagliostro film. This is not the most famous man in the world of anime speaking from a place of authority. This is just Hayao Miyazaki in his 30s talking about anime. What animation is to me? If I were asked to give my view in a nutshell of what animation is, I would say it is whatever I want to create. The world of animation is wide, and it includes not only animated series for television, but also commercials, experimental films, and theatrical features. But no matter what others may say, if it isn't something I really want to work on, it isn't animation to me. I'm talking about a very personal view of animation here, of course, and when it comes to my work, there are also obviously times when I have to compromise. In fact, there are times when I really have to struggle, and I suffer quite a bit in the process. In that regard, I feel particularly lucky that Future Boy Conan, a series I first worked on years ago, was not only something I wanted to create, but also work that I greatly enjoyed. In other words, I am talking about doing something with animation that can't be done with manga magazines, children's literature, or live-action films. I'm talking about building a truly unique imaginary world, tossing in characters I like, and then creating a complete drama using them. Simply put, this is what animation is to me, wanting one's own world. Animation, or anime, has become extremely popular among those we call mid-teens, and especially among middle school students. And why is this? I think I have a pretty good idea, or at least understand the background behind the phenomenon. Personally, I was never more passionate about manga than when preparing for my college entrance exams. It's a period of life when young people appear to have a great deal of freedom, but are in many ways actually very oppressed. Just when they find themselves powerfully attracted to members of the opposite sex, they have to really crack the books. To escape from this depressing situation, they often find themselves wishing they could live in a world of their own, a world they can say is truly theirs, a world unknown even to their parents. To young people, anime is something they can incorporate into this private world. I often refer to this feeling as one of yearning for a lost world. It's a sense that although you may currently be living in a world of constraints, if you were free from those constraints, you would be able to do all sorts of things. And it's this feeling, I believe, that makes mid-teens so passionate about anime. Skipping ahead a bit. Today, I rarely watch any animation that amazes me or makes my heart pound with excitement. I'd of course love to see works that do, even if only once a year. For most people, and not just professionals like myself, it's probably the way real animation is supposed to be after all. But creating animation of that caliber requires a huge amount of concentration, even when drawing the individual illustrations, and the animated film won't come to life unless the animators themselves pour their hearts and souls into their work. In reality, we rarely have the luxury of doing that, and even if we do throw ourselves into our work, in this industry we can never expect commensurate rewards or treatment. As a result, the sort of work I am describing cannot be created without the help of people who are truly willing to go hungry. I'm not talking about people who make experimental animation, but something completely different. I'm talking about those who create animation designed for a wide audience that includes children, the type of animation that cannot be made by a single individual. Commercial animation almost by definition requires group effort. Even if the animated images ultimately move as a result of the efforts of each individual member of the group, the final product can never be from one person alone. It must belong to everyone as well as to each individual. For us, the ultimate dream is to create works this way and have as many people as possible view them. Once upon a time, people who didn't work in the anime industry had little means by which to grasp what actually goes on therein. Likewise, in any industry, if you're not participating in it, if you haven't done something similar, it's hard for you to understand what the people who make it are going through. It might seem as though stuff just spawns into existence just for you to indulge in, and then you get to participate and suck your nutrients from it and move on to the next thing. But at the very least, there's always been an understanding that if you want something, you have to give something. Everything in this world is an exchange because we live in a capitalistic society. You can't just do whatever you want and live on that basis. And I think that's completely fair. Why should someone be rewarded for creating something which doesn't benefit the other members of society? Why should we take care of somebody who isn't doing anything for us in return in a world where there are limited resources, in a situation where there is a competition of need. If you're going to step outside of what society currently considers necessary, if you're going to do a job that people don't inherently think we need to be done, you have to prove the worth of what you are doing. The onus is on you to convince people that they need to allow you to continue to do this thing because it will, in the long run, benefit them in return. Art is a funny thing because art doesn't have tangible benefits. You can't just point at a piece of art and say it did this, except for in some very extreme cases where some kind of story just somehow caused a social change all on its own. But for the most part, it's more about the collective of art creating understanding within people. It's a slowly shifting sea of information that the more art gets created and the more it holds a mirror up to society, it gives us the chance to understand it and where it's going and where it's been. And for individuals, it can be an escape, or it can be a way to understand themselves better. It could just be something that takes up time in their day. Over the course of this month, I have shared no shortage of manners in which art helps people or purposes for art. And if you haven't been watching my videos, go ahead and watch them. This is the thematic through line of the month of videos I've been producing. Every piece of art exists on a continuum of broad to niche appeal. And what it means to be broadly appealing just means that your work resonates with the largest possible number of people. But when you're somebody who doesn't necessarily feel the same way as most of the people around you, it's more difficult for you to connect with something broad, because even if it does represent some of your emotions, you have other emotions that the people around you don't seem to understand, that you have a difficulty communicating. And when you connect with a piece of art that relates to those incredibly specific emotions, it's like you're being told, there's one for you too. There's a place for you as well in this world. Because as human beings, we are collectivist in mindset. We're always fighting for our perspective to be accepted or for people to perceive us as okay to exist. And for a lot of people, there might be something distinct about them that they try to hide because they think that society will not accept that aspect of them. But then when they see that there are other people who feel the same way they do, then they might think, well, maybe it's okay to feel this way. And so I'm going to try to fight for this to exist, for my right to be the distinctive person that I am. And personally, I feel that anyone who has a unique perspective is showing us something about society. They're showing us that somehow the way that the world is created this person. If someone seems to be so different from the rest of us, we have to look at them and say, how did our society generate this? What went wrong? Or what went right? Or just what happened? And this is why the art that I value the most is that which comes from the most unique perspectives. The art that has something extremely specific to say. Because you can watch 100 shows that say the same exact thing, and whatever minor differences there are between those shows are going to cause one person to like one more than another. Or maybe it's just a time and place thing, like how Precure airs every year, because Precure is always made for whoever happens to be 7 years old that year. Once you turn 8, you don't need Precure anymore, but there's a new batch of 7-year-olds who do. And because the original Precure will become dated as time goes on, the new batch of 7-year-olds won't relate to the original Precure as easily because it's talking about social issues that were existing in the year 2000. But now you've got a Precure for this generation. And even if the evolution seems kind of minor or the shows are mostly broadly the same, if you were to chart your progress through all the Precures, you would probably see the slow change of society. So it is necessary for all of these broad things to exist that are all basically the same. But if you're someone like me, who's already seen those broad messages and doesn't care anymore, there's no reason for you to participate in them. There's no reason to watch those shows. There's no reason to talk about them. There's no reason to support them financially. you're basically just chasing the dragon of the obscure. You're constantly looking for the new perspective, for the unique perspective. And the thing that is the scariest is witnessing a system where those unique perspectives do not have the opportunity to exist, because the systems in place and the mindset of the people propping up those systems will not allow those media to have the chance to thrive. Now, granted, if you are a real badass who dedicates yourself entirely to just making the art you want to make, and you'll do anything to make that possible, that's amazing. And those types of artists, again, they're going to have to just prove the worth of their message, try to get it out there, and you can do things that way. But there was a time in anime history where you could create something that was visionary and also really well produced, and it was going to be funded on the back of a community that understood that the only reason that this incredibly niche media was able to be created at the level of polish that it was is that they were proving its worth, that they were voting with their dollar and pouring an exorbitant amount of money into its existence because they gave a shit. And I don't expect most people to give a shit. The anime community now is much bigger because it's much broader. Most of the people who are in this huge anime community are not watching the niche products. The growth of broad and niche anime has been proportional to one another. Back when I was first getting into anime in a big way, when I started watching shows that were being subtitled along with their Japanese airing, I was watching shows like Hidamari Sketch or Manabi Straight that had maybe a few hundred viewers in the Western fan base. There just was not a gigantic audience for these shows. And there might have been tens of thousands of people watching Naruto. And over time, it came to be that now there are hundreds of thousands of people who have seen Naruto, and maybe a few thousand or even a few tens of thousands of people who have seen Hidamari Sketch and Manabi Straight. But just because the big anime can sustain themselves on requiring less and less participation from the audience because it is now broad media, this does not mean that anime is now broad media. It means that broad anime is now broad media. And the niche titles, they might, because they have, twice the following they once did in the West, have better odds of penetrating this market, but they will not live in the paradigms that the large media will, and they never have. To continue the existence of One Piece, no one has ever had to go out and buy hundreds of dollars of One Piece merchandise. One Piece is a self-perpetuating engine. It appeals to such a large number of people that just the sales of Shonen Jump alone that it creates would be enough to keep Eiichiro Oda making millions of dollars. But if you are publishing something that only appeals to 100 people, it's up to those 100 people to spend enough money on it to keep it alive. And if you can't inspire them to do that, then your work is just not going to be capable of existing. But I don't think that we need to be placing all of the blame on the people who create niche art when we've entered a culture where so many people want it but don't want to do anything about it. And I think that can be changed. I really don't think that it's just innate in people that they won't pay for the things that they love, because evidence is to the contrary. The Japanese otaku market was entirely bolstered on this. And granted, there was a period in the late 80s when the OVA market was super booming and you got all this really crazy out there shit that was extremely well produced, and then their economy crashed and people could not afford to buy extremely expensive Blu-rays anymore. And so there just wasn't a market for that. And then once we got into the age of piracy and it became that people could watch stuff for free, and most of them can't necessarily afford to, again, pay these insane prices, then it's just not something that became viable. But the paradigm has shifted massively. People don't necessarily all want there to be a physical product tied to it. They just want to have the art they love. And Patreon is just a symptom of the idea that people are changing their mindset towards art. I don't particularly like Patreon as a platform. I have tons of problems with Patreon. I've made videos criticizing Patreon in the past. When I talk about Patreon, I talk about them as a foot in the door. They're a step in the right direction. It's just that we should be constantly reminding people that there is deeper art they can be involved with, and that if they want it to happen, they have to pay for it. But they don't have to pay the insane amounts that they used to have to pay, because we don't need physical media for people to be able to watch the things they like. So you don't have to account for how much does the distribution company need in order to make this possible. You don't have to account for how much does the broadcasting company need to make this possible. You don't have to get the A-list actors onto your niche property show. You don't have to participate in the industry. You can step outside of it. And if you are running a cult group like Trigger obviously wants to produce things that are on a level that they would not be able to, within the current paradigm, promote on just the back of fan funding. Now, granted, they crowdfunded a 45-minute OVA of Little Witch Academia. And from there, we're able to expand on that universe because it had proven the worth of the IP to production committees who could fund it further. And even if that's all Patreon amounted to, I would be okay with that. But the point is simply that we got Little Witch Academia because people wanted it enough. Because the vision was strong enough. And that vision was backed by the Japanese government trying to make this happen. That literally, the Young Animator Training Project was just pouring money into anyone with a good idea. They poured some money into Trigger. Trigger made that good idea, and people resonated with it, and because they had the rights to this IP, they were able to just crowdfund a second one, and it worked. People did pay for a double-length full episode of anime. And Little Witch Academia, to me, is so much better than anything else that was coming out at the time that there is no need for me to support the anime industry. I would be happy to just support that. As Miyazaki said, even if it was only once a year that I got to see truly exciting animation, it would be worth it. It would be worth it to slow the production schedules down, to tell people you don't need to make 12 episodes of a show. You don't need to make every episode 22 minutes because you have to fill the allotted time that part of your production committee, TV Tokyo or whoever, requires you to have the episodes be this length so they can run it on their network and follow their paradigm, and therefore you have to now base your story around this idea. If we were supporting companies entirely through crowdfunding, they would have no reason to follow any of these restrictions. They could just make what they want to make. And granted, I know that nobody wants them to just totally fly off the deep end. I mean, some of us might, but like most people want some degree of normalcy. Most people don't want it to try to go way the fuck out there. But these companies are already meeting you way more than halfway. I just think we should make it so that they can meet us maybe, 40% of the way. Maybe they can create something that has more vision, and to the people like me who will be more excited to see something that is totally unique as opposed to something that has to follow the rules, we will be greatly appreciative of that. And since the entire ethos of Trigger, what they present in their work, what their shows are about, is changing paradigms. Their shows are about contesting stagnation. Their shows are about trying to escape. They are otaku media. They're all coded heavily towards this hardcore audience. And the reason that Trigger goes to panels fucking constantly is that they're trying to put a face to themselves. They want you to know, here's who we are. This is not just a faceless corporation. This is not just a bunch of production studios churning out stuff for you. These are people who care about their work, who care about what it represents, who have a personality and an ethos that is represented even in the way they run their panels, that is presented in the way they do everything. So of course it makes perfect sense for them to be the ones who open up a Patreon. And granted, they haven't even really made a move on trying to push this thing. And I don't even know if they should yet, because not only is the iron not hot enough to strike on crowdfunding just yet, but Patreon's not necessarily the best platform, and, we don't know how much can be made on there. But let's say that Trigger did the same thing they did with Little Witch Academia, but more on purpose this time. Let's say that they produced a 15-minute animation entirely funded out of pocket. They just said, fuck it, we're going to take some bank loans, we're going to fund a 15-minute animation, post it online, and tell people, hey, if you can raise this amount of money on Patreon, this becomes a full show. And they make it very clear exactly what money will be spent on what, because there's no reason for them to not be transparent about everything in this case. Because the only reason you ever have to have non-disclosure is that you're working with multiple entities. If you're just producing something yourself, like me, this is why I am capable of being so honest, is that I don't answer to sponsors, I don't have to hide anything because there's no NDAs involved in what I do. If they just come out and say, here's what the money's for, here's what we want to produce, if we can make this much, we'll do it. There's a chance that it'll work, and they just have to really fucking drill it in. They might have to go into their own pockets to pay for advertising, but guess what they can also do? They can also contact people who give a shit and have a platform, like me, to do that promotion for them. Because there are passionate fans out there who just want it to exist, who have no ulterior motives. I don't need Trigger to pay me to promote something like that. Now, granted, the reason I haven't given Trigger that much money on Patreon is because I was not a big fan of Darling in the Franxx, and that's because what I see in Darling in the Franxx is an attempt to make something more broad than what Trigger does, and they fill it with Trigger calling cards, so it's still Trigger enough that their fans won't hate it, but it's just Trigger baby mode. It's literally a watered down version of the stuff that they have previously done to sell to a bigger audience, and it worked. And because they have that, they have more funding they can now put into other projects, or more clout, or more pull with the, with the corporations that they work with. But what I want to see Trigger do is to break away. I want to see them take a big risk. And if Trigger came out tomorrow with an announcement on Patreon like, look, we're taking this more seriously, and like, if we can make $100,000 a month, then we're gonna use that to fund a 3-episode OVA by the end of next year, I would be down. I would much rather see whatever they come up with as a 3-episode OVA than whatever they're gonna have to work through the production committees to create. And granted, again, I am not in the majority of this opinion, and that is fine. This is not something I expect most anime fans to agree with. Nothing I produce is. I am not here to speak to the largest audience. I'm speaking to the niche. If you are someone who really believes in the power of niche media, I am only trying to reach you to tell you the power is in your hands. The only people who can prove that this stuff needs to exist are the people who are willing to make it able to exist. Fuck the majority, fuck whoever thinks that this is impossible, fuck people who are not going to become patrons. Don't think about them. Think about who is going to become patrons. Think about how much you can do, and do as much as you can. If you can't do anything, fine. Some people were reaching out to me after my previous video asking, like, if I don't have enough money to give to the industry, what should I do? Just take care of yourself, because that's the way that a capitalistic system works, is that you give to others when you are yourself secure. So secure yourself Worry about these people later, because again, the onus is on them to collect the money for the things they want to create. You know, it's all about this push and pull. It's all about they have to prove to the audience that what they are doing is worth your money, and you have to prove to them that you will give them your money if you can. But don't worry about it if you can't. Other people were asking me, if Patreon only exists for Trigger right now, what do I do to support all the other shows I love? And my answer would be nothing. Nothing until they provide you an avenue you're comfortable with. Do not let people bully you into thinking that you have to support them, because they can change. Anyone can change. Anyone can leave the paradigm they're in and take a risk. I've taken monumental risks in my career, and granted, I'm just one person, and I have a lot of backing. I take my risks very calculatedly, but there are times where I have literally strike and burned my entire fucking career. I changed the whole identity of my channel multiple times, burned away the majority of my subscribers, and built them back up. You can do that, and it's harder when there's more people involved, but if it wasn't hard, it wouldn't be worth doing. You just have to demand more. You have to say, hey, I love that you're making me these shows, but I don't approve of the way that you're funding them. I don't approve of having to pay for a subscription service I don't trust or like, that is going to use my money for things I don't want them to use it for. I don't approve of having to buy plastic bullshit. Just give me a Patreon or you don't get my money. You have the power to say that. And if you think that's being unfair or whatever, fine, think that. I don't give a shit. I'm just telling you the vision I have for the industry I want. If you think it's dangerous to advocate for this because you will lose out on the shows that you want to see, go ahead and make counterpoints. Go ahead and make your own videos encouraging people to get on Crunchyroll. But just know that nothing I am saying here is out of ignorance. Because if you think that what I'm saying will destroy the industry, you're right. Because that's what I want to happen. I want to destroy the industry as it currently stands, to uproot it, to pull the bottom out from under it, and see where it tries to cling to as it falls. So, you know, I just want to see a change. I want to see a shifting paradigm. And Patreon's not the only way to do it. Any of these companies can make their own proprietary version of that. You could literally just set up a donation box on your website and have fans make donations. You could create your own version of Patreon. You could create some kind of system by which the audience can participate in a more meaningful way in the media. There's just so much that could be done. There are so many paradigms that haven't been explored. You can code anything on a website. You could make a web page that is fundamentally in itself like a funding platform for your own thing. People just have to start thinking about it. People need to start finding methods. And that's what I'm going to be doing going forward. I'm not solely going to rely on my Patreon anymore. I have been relying on it primarily, and it has been an unclean way of doing what I do. It hasn't really made sense for me or for the patrons for everything to just be filtered through this one hub. So I'm also going to look for alternative ways to promote my content, and I'm going to try to share these ideas. Anything I come up with that works or doesn't work, I'll tell you why, and we can all work on finding new paradigms. Just don't trust the ones that are already in place just because they're already in place and they're safe. Safety, feeling comfortable that things can just continue as they are, is how nothing changes. And if you don't like the state of things, then you need to be looking for changes. By the way, daily reminder, Jeff Du is a fucking moron.